Welcome to Rock, Paper, Swords, the historical action and adventure podcast. My name is Matthew Harffy.
And my name is Stephen A. McKay.
We're both best-selling historical fiction authors, and together we chat about all things historical and anything that could fall under the banner of action and adventure in books, film, TV, and games.
And we also talk about rock music sometimes.
Today, we're going to talk about research. In particular, how we go about it for our novels, what resources we use, and which books and other things are at the top of our go-to research pile. Over to you, Stephen. Okay. How do you research?
I usually use Google and Wikipedia, and that's basically it. That's the extent of my research.
I think that's good enough, isn't it? I mean, Wikipedia. I mean, my wife will be furious if she hears us say this because she's actually an academic librarian. So yeah, I think she's not a great fan of Wikipedia.
Right.
But it is. I find it a great place to start research, though.
I was making a joke, but
I know.
I actually do use.
In seriousness,
I do use Wikipedia and Google all the time
as a stepping in point to research. Yeah, and it is interesting how much you can find doing random searches, but also, of course, you do need to corroborate things and make sure that you're not reading some crazy person's blog that's just made something up.
Well, I usually use it, pardon me, for say you need to know, the likes of us definitely need to know what the names were of certain towns back in Anglo-Saxon times, Viking times, or whatever. And Wikipedia is perfect for that, because you can look up Google Maps and you think, well, they go from here to there on the map, which you can do on Google Maps. And then you can just click on the name of the town and it'll bring up the Wikipedia page and it will tell you the history of the name. And from there, you can maybe look up the Domesday Book or whatever online and find the actual name of the town back then. And they usually give you a few certain spellings, and you can pick your own one and go from there.
Yeah, I've got the Oxford Dictionary of English Place Names that I use quite a lot.
An actual book?
It's a book, book. Yeah, I've got quite a lot of books. I tend not to buy that many new books nowadays because they're so expensive, especially lots of this sort of the more academic historical sort of ones. But
yeah, they can be really expensive.
But yeah, I think when I started doing the research for the Bernicia Chronicles, I of course it was 21 years ago, so it was really before there was as many resources as there are now online as well, and so I did a lot of secondhand book shopping, just going to the local Oxfam shop and things, and whenever I'd see something about the history of the Anglo-Saxons or things like that, I would buy them. So yeah, I've got quite a lot of those things. But yeah, I did buy this English place names, Dictionary of English Place Names, which is useful, and it gives you the historical, when the things are mentioned, so quite good.
It's handy, but I would imagine it'd be quite hard to find stuff if you're used to just, Wikipedia telling you straight away.
Oh, well, no, because it's just in alphabetical order with the modern name. So you just search. So you search for London.
You search the modern name.
Yeah. You just give the modern name, and it gives you the historical entries going back. So like say 14th century it was this, and it gives you like the etymology of it as well, and tells you. Yeah. So it's really, really useful. It's a little paperback. It's not a really big.
Yeah, I've seen it, but like you say, I think it's quite expensive.
Well, I don't know. I definitely didn't buy that new.
No. I'll need to have a look for it.
There you go.
I've definitely seen that reviewed somewhere, and I looked at buying it.
It's I bought it secondhand, but it's definitely worth a punt.
Yeah, I'll have a look at that. Anyone in historical fiction writing kind of needs to know this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The other day I actually maybe saved this for our review episode that we keep on talking about doing. But somebody did. I was reading some of my bad reviews in preparation for that, and somebody had said something about he relies too much on using like the old names for places.
Well, that's what I mean when I say Wikipedia in that book. I'd imagine will give you maybe 4 or 5 different versions of the name. Even the Domesday Book will have different versions of the name of the place. So what I do is I usually just find one that looks the best to me maybe the simplest to spell. It's closest to the modern word that we use
That's interesting.
today.
I tend to go for the one that's furthest away from the modern spelling and that looks most archaic, and that's probably what pissed off the reviewer.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah, because I think it gives that. I think it's like part of the historical fiction writing is sort of to conjure up a feeling of authenticity that you're in a different world. And so for me, calling a place something very different from what we know it now, I think it's part of that conjuring up that mystery.
Yeah, I know what you mean. But at the same time, I like things that are easy to read rather than having loads of extra letters just shoved in that's seemingly at random the way they used to do back then.
So here's the question. You mentioned the Doomsday Book a couple of times. Have you got a copy of the Doomsday Book?
No, it's only recently, just maybe in the past 2 weeks or something, that I started to find it on Google.
So interesting enough, I have 2 copies of the Doomsday Book. So perhaps after this podcast, you could give me your address if I don't have it already, and I could send you one of my copies of the Doomsday Book, which I'm sure you would find useful, because there's no point in me having 2 sitting on my shelf.
I'll take that. I'll take anything for free.
I know you will. Anyway, so the Doomsday Book, if anybody doesn't know, the Doomsday Book, what was the Doomsday Book, Stephen?
Don't ask me. I believe it was a list of, was it a kind of government document of places and like a taxation type thing?
Pretty much. Yeah, I think it was like the sort of the census after the Norman Conquest, so the very beginning of the Norman Conquest, the late sort of second half of the 11th century, after I think it was like the 1060s, 1080s, 1070s, whatever. And it was a compilation of everything that was owned and who owned what and what land was owned by whom and all of that stuff. And I think it was really basically just to make sure they could tax everybody correctly.
But looking at the scans online, it's extremely difficult to read to our modern eyes. It's obviously not printed on a nice, easy to read font. It's some guys sitting down writing it by hand.
Oh, absolutely,
It's
and lots of people probably. Many people, I'd imagine.
Yeah.
So the copies I've got are not just facsimiles, so they are actually modern print. So you'll be able to read them a little bit easier.
Well, no, I was just going to say that the things that we read for research now are so much easier on the eyes. So why don't we start with some? You've got the topics down here. As the first one is general history of Britain in the medieval period. So I'll go first with a wee research book that I like.
Okay.
So we've got the Time Traveller's Guide to Medieval England by Ian Mortimer.
Ah, okay. I haven't got that one.
You're kidding? This is a classic.
I don't think. Hold it up. Let me see the cover. I don't think. Oh, I might have it. I don't know.
He's written a few, I think, of different periods. But it's basically what it would be like if you turned up in medieval England as you are now and had to try and fit in. So it's got things like the price of a pint of beer, how much you would be paid if you were a carpenter.
Useful
in those
stuff.
days. It's excellent, but it's also really well written in an engaging kind of narrative way. Here we go. I'll just quickly flick through it. Townhouses, where to stay. And then it describes the poorest town dwellers are not people with whom you're likely to stay. And then it goes into a whole big spiel about what a townhouse would be like for the cheap people, the poor people and the richer people. And then you've got health and hygiene, the law. So there's fines, a penalty for bakers for, making bad bread or whatever. And all these different headings. And it's a good book to read. It's a fun book to read, but it's also extremely valuable when it comes to research for, if you're writing about medieval period, as I was with Robin Hood at the time.
Yeah, I have a similar book to that I read, and I've got a copy. I've got 2 copies of that as well. somebody gave me actually a copy. I had the paperback, and somebody's given me the hardback. The Year 1000. Have you read that one?
No, who's written that?
It's written by Robert Lacey and Danny Danziger. So this is similar to what you were saying, but it's based. I think it's. I'm trying to remember now. It's based on the different months of the year. and it just sort of basically it's very well written, and it just looks like in like the year 1000, what people would have been doing in each of those months, and so it just goes through and sort of describes all the things that would have
Oh,
happened
right.
as part of. So it's really interesting.
The harvest time, and
Yeah, and
because I'm always looking up stuff like harvest time for
well, you
scenes
know
in,
what?
in
As I
books.
have 2 copies of this, that
Perfect.
could be
Send
slipping.
it on.
That could be slipping into your Doomsday book post as well. Yeah, so it's time to meet someone from the year 1000, at least to the extent that dry legal documents can provide human contact across the years. Here is Alflad, a noblewoman who died sometime between 1000 and 1002, leaving huge estates in Essex and East Anglia. And then it goes on and just sort of talks about specific people in different times and what they would do.
Well, even that, it's interesting, just that sentence. It's a noble woman.
Yeah.
Who's died and left all these rich estates, which is, that's interesting in itself. As a woman.
I've actually used it. I folded over the edges.
All my books are like that. They're all underlined, pages folded over. It's horrendous, actually. People would be disgusted the way I treat books.
Well.
But no, I've got something similar here, but I'll talk about that when we go on to the next topic, AD 500 and it. But I'll talk about that when we go.
Sort of talking about the sort of more of the general, because this is very much, I think we've sort of touching on a little on one of the topics we're going to go on to later on already, but sort of talking about the sort of the general history of the time in my books, like the Anglo-Saxon period for most of my books. So talking about the kings and who's the king of who, where, and when did they fight and everything. I do actually use the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle as a first port of call there, which was written, I believe it was written sort of in the time of Alfred the Great, but looking back over these, there's probably lots of it is wrong, and it's all got to be taken with a bit of pinch of salt. And the further back you go, the more vague it gets. But I also look at the Venerable Bede and his history of the ecclesiastical history of the English people. I think it's called something like that in Latin. Yeah. And he gives a lot more detail, of course, of the 7th century, which is when I'm writing about in the Benicia Chronicles. So he was born at the end, I think, sort of the second half, late 7th century, and or something like that, 7th, 8th century, somewhere around there. So it was quite recent to him. So I think he was interviewing people that had lived at the time, sometimes other monks that had been around that were old, that remembered some of the kings and stuff. And so he talks about King Oswald and about different anecdotes that happened. So I do lift bits from there and really try to incorporate them into the stories.
I've also got this one going back to the small people rather than the kings. Life in the Medieval Village by
good.
Francis and Joseph Guise. Or Guys, I don't know how you pronounce that. Have you read that one?
No, I haven't. So
they do have one about a castle as well, but that's more like French castles and stuff, and it's not as useful. Whereas this is really about a kind of a small village in England, and it's Elton actually.
Well, it's interesting because your books that you wrote before the Druid books were all set in much later medieval period than the period that I tend to write about. So it's interesting. Obviously, some of your books are sort of higher medieval, sort of later medieval period, but I also find that I have got some books that are set, like for the sort of day-to-day life, that are set later, and I find that it's very easy to extrapolate that back in time anyway, because the life of a peasant, it doesn't change
farming and stuff like that. The clothes they wore wouldn't have been drastically different. The technology was much the same, and this has got all of that in it, like the villagers, who they were, the lord, the type of house, how it was built, the construction, and village justice, the village at work, what kind of jobs they did. And, it's not quite as interesting to read as Ian Mortimer's one, but as a research book, it's perfect. And it's got lists of names and stuff like that from court rolls, which are ideal for a historical fiction author to use in their books, mix and match.
Yeah, I've got a book a bit like that called Lost Country Life by Dorothy someone. It's such an old book. I'm just putting it off my shelf. Dorothy Hartley. So the spine of it, I couldn't see on the spine. The name is knackered. But how English country folk lived, worked, threshed, thatched, rolled fleece, milled corn, brewed mead. So, but it's much more geared towards, and again, this has got monthly, it tells you each month what they were doing. This is really
Right.
useful.
Uh-huh.
But it's much more geared towards sort of later in history, I think. It's not only medieval, but the day-to-day life of people really
It
up
would be
until
quite
the
similar.
Industrial Revolution
Mhm.
didn't really change. So yeah, I find that quite useful. I think it's an American book. It's printed in the USA, but it's definitely talking about British
Dorothy
country
Hartley.
life. That's good. I haven't
So
used
is
it as
that
much as
JR's sister?
probably,
Fly fishing.
probably. But if anyone knows, that's a great advert.
I'm sure everybody knows it.
I just found a bizarre cutting inside this book, which I definitely didn't put it there. It's a cutting about mid-year.
Mid-year. Somebody called me a shit mid-year on Facebook the other day.
Somebody's put a cutting in it about mid-year. It's called Mid-Year. Too Little, Too Late is the headline.
No,
I'm
I
not going to
agree
read
with
it, but there you go.
He was in Thin Lizzy. He's a guitarist, which amazed me.
Wow. There you
go. Yeah. So those two books that I've picked, and I think the ones you've picked as well, they give you a good background in, the actual daily life, how people brewed beer, how they worked, the jobs they did and things like that. But I also like to branch out a wee bit. So for my new book, which I won't mention too much, but I'm using this as a wee bit of research.
you mean a new book that you're writing?
Yes.
Which
I can't really talk about just yet.
Okay.
But the research for it is this Brian Bates, The Way of Weird.
It's a bit esoteric.
Exactly. It's supposedly about Anglo-Saxon, almost coming into the Viking period, magic, magician type. Not a druid, but that kind of idea. It's not a particularly good book. I'm not really enjoying reading it very much.
I think I've got a Brian Bates book, and I seem to remember that wasn't very good either.
I like to read things like this. I did it when I was researching Robin Hood as well. I would read things that were a bit more esoteric, and they went into the mythology and the magic and the mysticism and stuff, because people back then really did believe in this stuff much more than we do now. And it helps you to bring out things for characters. Just give them extra things to believe in and maybe make it a bit more realistic for a modern reader to understand this kind of stuff. So although I'm not enjoying this book very much, I'm finding it very handy, and I've got, like you, the pages are all
Why are you not enjoying it?
It's just kind of a boring book, and it's not very well written. I actually read about the first chapter and I gave up. I thought it was terrible.
This is really interesting, because I just looked on my shelf and I've got a book by Brian Bates as well, and it's called The Real Middle Earth. And
I think actually that I've bought that as well. I never even realised it was the same guy.
I don't think it's great either.
I never realised it was the same author, but I did buy that.
Well, unless there's two Brian Bates writing about the Dark Ages, seems unlikely.
And mysticism, and well, it says on it reads like a fusion of Carlos Castaneda and Tolkien.
Yeah, so the Real Middle Earth. So just for anyone who's not aware, I have been called up before by a reader saying about my use of the word Middle Earth, or the term Middle Earth in my books in the Bernicia Chronicles, saying it's not fantasy, this isn't Tolkien.
But they did use that.
Well, of course, it's the Old English term, and and the Vikings called it Midgard.
Which just means Middle Earth.
It's the Middle Earth. It's the Earth between the heaven and hell. Basically, it's the middle. It's where we live and where humans live. And so yes, Middle Earth is in fact the Old English term
for Earth, basically.
For Earth, yeah. And so it amused me. But yeah, so when people talk about the real Middle Earth, he's talking about the Anglo-Saxon period and the Norse. So yeah,
I'll have that to look forward to.
Yeah, I'm thinking about other books. So, but sort of general history of the period of the Anglo-Saxons, sort of covering the whole Anglo-Saxon period. There's a book called by Nicholas J. Hyam and Martin J. Ryan, which is the Anglo-Saxon World, and that's a big chunky volume which came out just a few years ago, and that's a big, good book that covers the whole period. There's another book came out quite recently that did very well called The Anglo-Saxons by Mark Morris.
There's nothing, I've got that in Audible.
Okay, there's nothing in that, as far as I could see, that brought anything new to the table. It's one of those books when you've read lots about the Anglo-Saxon
Yeah,
period,
you know it.
you sort of think, well, yeah, I know all this, but it's well written and it's easy. It's easy to consume and read.
Yeah, well, I listened to the chapters on Audible that are relevant to my research, and it was easy to listen to, so I would recommend it.
Yeah, it makes a difference if something's well written. And that sounds like an obvious comment, but some books really aren't very well written. Another one that's very well written, that's really good for the period of the Bernicia Chronicles, and it's really acted as a sort of a non-fiction accompaniment to the Bernicia Chronicles, is The King in the North by Max Adams. It's actually published by Head of Zeus, like me.
Right.
And anyone who's eagle-eyed will notice that the maps in it are very similar in design to mine, because they're done by the same cartographer in the style of Tolkien. And obviously, we cover the same period in history, so lots of it is very similar.
So is that a novel?
It's not a novel. No, it's a non-fiction book about King Oswald and the 7th century. So supposedly it's a biography of King Oswald. The reality is that King Oswald, there's not that much written about him. So there's probably like 2 chapters that are sort of his biography, and the rest of the book, which is a big chunky book, is just the whole sort of history of the 7th century. So it covers Oswy and Edwin and the whole period that I write about, and keeps going on right to the end of the 7th century, really, and talks about its place in the world and loads of stuff. So it's really, really good.
I thought you were actually going to mention this one. When you were...
Oh, I've got that as well.
Yeah, I know you have. I think that's why I bought it. I think I saw it's The Mead Hall by Stephen Pollington.
Yeah.
The feasting tradition in Anglo-Saxon England. And as you say, nothing really changed much over these periods, over hundreds of years. So it might be about Anglo-Saxon England, but this is going to fit my Druid books and Viking era books and stuff like that. Everything's kind of similar. The halls are the same. The stuff that we're drinking and eating was much the same. So this is a really good book. It's not particularly easy read, but there's plenty in it where you can find stuff to use in your own books. Just slot in little lines and little bits of research from that to make it more authentic.
Yeah, Stephen Pollington's a really knowledgeable writer about the Anglo-Saxon period specifically. I've got another book of his actually called The English Warrior from Earliest Times till 1066. And that's, again, by Stephen Pollington, and that's really good as well, and goes into a lot of detail about the warrior culture of the Anglo-Saxons, and basically about everything you could imagine, from their weaponry to how they thought and how they structured their armies, and how they structured the nobility and why they thought the way they did, and everything that you could really want to know about warriors. And
it's perfect period. Something like that, you would even just a line to slot into your novel, it makes it sound so much more authentic if you can take it from something like that, from reality. I mentioned this one earlier, AD 500 by Simon Young.
Yeah, I got that one as well. I just saw it on my shelf.
You got it?
I don't think I've read it, but I've got it on my shelf.
Well, it's probably not quite relevant as much to your later period, because the Romans have just left at this point. So it's perfect for my Druid stuff. And it's basically just, he goes around the whole of Britain. Again, it's as if he's a time traveller or a traveller. I think he's supposed to be a traveller from Rome, actually. And he goes around Britain, Cornwall and Wales, Ireland, Scotland, the Picts and Worse, England, and it just basically describes all the different courts and the people you might meet and the things they believe in and the foods they would eat and all this kind of stuff. So that's an excellent book for anybody writing around the AD 500 period. It's really well researched and it just fits so well with my own books.
That's good stuff. So we've done lots of sort of general history of the period and everything. Have you got? We've talked about the way of life as well. One of the other topics I had here was about clothing. It's something I always find quite difficult to find a lot of really good detail about what people wore.
Yeah, you don't get many books that are just specifically about clothing. However, I see your next heading there is weapons and military.
Well, I was going to say about the clothing one before we move on to the weapons and military. Well, a lot more about that.
I was going to include the clothing. That's what I was going to say. But carry on. If you've got something extra about the clothing, carry on.
I've got a book called Dress in Anglo-Saxon England by Owen Crocker and or Owen and Crocker, I don't know. But anyway, it's on my shelf back there, and yeah, that's really good. And it sort of talks about the clothing and the evidence, the archaeological evidence for the clothing for each period in the Anglo-Saxon period, which of course Anglo-Saxon England covers from 5th century right through to 11th century. So it's a really big span. And so it's useful in that it tells you what sort of jewelry women were wearing, what type of clothing they got, whether they were wearing longer dresses or shorter dresses and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, that sounds handy. I'll have to
That's
get a
really
copy
good.
of that. You've not got 2 copies of that, have you?
I haven't got 2 copies of that. I think that was a more expensive one.
That's
yeah, I haven't. Sorry, mate. I noticed I got 2 copies of a book about the Sutton Hoo helmet as well. So all my twofers, I'll just send you an extra copy.
But it's actually about that helmet specifically.
Yeah. Yes,
right.
I bought it at the British Museum, I think, right. And I don't know how I got 2 of them.
You bought 2 by accident?
I don't know. Who knows?
I'll take this as well. That looks good.
So you're saying about, well, that's a nice segue. The Sutton Hoo helmet. Moving on to armor and weapons.
Well, we have to include Osprey.
Oh yes,
these Osprey publishers. These are the absolute best books for a historical fiction author that's writing about military stuff. Anyway,
yes, they're really good.
So many of these books. I must have about 20 of them.
And they're only thin, little, skinny paperbacks that
they're cheap.
And they're like a tenner or less.
Well, you can find them. You can find them cheaper than that on Amazon, £7 or something, maybe.
Yeah, and they're very specific. So I'm just looking at some of my titles of the ones I've got here on my shelf. So Anglo-Saxon Thane, AD 449 to 1066.
In my hands.
Yeah. You've got British forts in the Age of Arthur.
I've got that one. Yep.
Yeah. Arthur and the Anglo-Saxon Wars.
Yep, I've got that.
Yeah,
yep.
Yeah. Fortifications in Wessex.
Yep.
800 to 1066. Strongholds of the Picts.
Yep.
Pictish warrior.
Yep.
Yeah. So
we've got all of these.
We've all got the same ones. So yeah, luckily I don't need to send you all my copies.
I've also got, unless you've got 2, but I've also got the ones about the Romans. So there's various Roman centurions.
Yeah.
They're out. There's like 3 different books on the Roman centurion alone, the stuff they would wear. And I've also got the medieval ones where it's the Knights Hospitaller and all their various shields and their banners and helmets they would wear and all this. And that's basically what you get in these books.
Yeah, it gives you like an overview of the history of that particular type of warrior you're looking at or whatever it is. They do things about certain campaigns as well in battles and things.
Yeah, they go into a bit more detail in some of them.
Yeah, I've got one here. I mean, I bought a few actually secondhand recently. Oh, knocking all my books over. I bought some recently from Ben Kane, who was selling some off for charity. He does this regularly, sells things off to raise money for charity. I don't know where he got these books from, but I bought a few. So I've got Armies of the Muslim Conquest. So they do things like that as well. I
don't have that one.
No, well, but that maybe. I've got some about Vikings, and I've got some about Byzantine warriors, and so yeah, there's a few different periods that obviously we touched on.
I've just opened this, the Anglo-Saxon one, and it's clothing. That's one of the headings. And it's cloaks, tunics, leggings and footwear, headgear. So it describes it all.
Yeah, they're really good at giving sort of a snapshot. I think sometimes if you look at in detail at the history, they're a bit questionable, or they don't go into enough detail, or they kind of gloss over things. But for sort of the level of detail that you need to include in an action adventure novel, it's probably enough. Yeah.
And there's lots of photographs, and in particular in the centre of each book, they've got detailed pictures of like a warrior, and then they explode the diagram and they tell you what the helmet's made up from, what it consists of, what the shield's made up of, all the various parts, the sword, the various parts of each sword, and where they found it archaeologically. And it's just these Osprey books are ideal for historical fiction authors, and they're so cheap.
Yeah, they're brilliant, and they're often you're saying about photos. They got like full color paintings, sort of artist impressions of the periods as well, and things. And they're often lots of them are by Angus McBride, who's a fantastic artist who's sadly no longer with us. But he used to do the lots of paintings for the Middle Earth role playing game. going back to
All
Middle
right,
Earth. So for
right.
like the Tolkien role playing game back in the 80s and 90s. But yeah, his paintings are fantastic. He did
Yeah,
loads of the Osprey
they're
stuff
always
and
so
really,
good. Yeah,
really
they're
good.
really evocative.
They're really evocative because he puts in like 2 or 3 warriors in a different poses, but they're never just sort of standing there looking boring. They're sort of doing something
Yeah, they've got
exciting.
their mouths open, they're shouting and they're fighting and they're getting stabbed in the guts
Yeah,
by a
yeah.
spear and stuff like that.
There's
And
something going on. Yeah,
they're wearing a, say maybe a green tunic, and I'll write in my book, oh, he was wearing a green tunic, because I'll just look at the picture in the Osprey book and I'll go, well, that's perfect. I'll just use that. So you mix and match a green tunic from one picture and the helmet from another, and there you go. It's authentic.
yeah. It certainly feels authentic, even if even if some sort of archaeologist will look at it and say, "Well, I don't know about some of that." They definitely get that authenticity feeling about it
Yeah,
all.
which is the main thing if you're trying to tell a good story.
Yeah, which is I think those paintings by Angus McBride and the other artists that have done that, they do those color paintings in the Osprey books. I think they're very much doing similar to what we do as storytellers. They very quickly tell a story. They try to be as authentic as they possibly can with what the armor is, but it's their interpretation of it within the context. So another category I've got in here is about geography and maps. So you talked about names of places. Obviously, I think we mentioned it another time we were talking as another episode, but obviously they're always traveling around. It's very important to make sure that we know where they're going, and you mentioned the names of the places, but how long it takes them. Yeah, and what the terrain was like at the time. So one of the things that I think people will not think about very much, and I know I didn't think about it when I started writing, was how much the landscape changes over time. And obviously, a mountain that's there now is has always been a mountain, unless there's been a massive volcanic eruption or something that's blown it away, which does happen. But often in the British Isles, you get areas which were total swamps or submerged almost, which now are dry. So you go somewhere and you think, oh yeah, I understand what this coastline looks like, but actually back in 700 AD or something, it would have been underwater or been
it was a whole river or something,
marshland or a river, or the rivers moved. So those things are really interesting. So what sort of resources do you use for that sort of stuff?
Well, I've got a few maps, ordnance survey maps that fold out. But to be honest, I hardly ever use them because they fold out so big, and my study's so small that they take up the entire thing, and then you try to fold them back in.
Is that the Ordnance Survey map of the Dark Ages Britain? Is it called?
No, that's a different. I've got
Britain
that one as well.
Ages.
I do have that one as well. I think again I saw you posted a picture of it, so I bought it.
Yeah, because that one's great, but it's out of print now. You have to buy it secondhand. I think it was printed like in the 70s or 60s.
It's an ancient one I've got. No, it's this one. OS Historical.
Oh, Ancient Britain.
This one's Ancient Britain, and I've also got Ancient Roman one as well. But
yeah, I
don't really open them up that often.
Yeah, so even the one that we said, the Dark Age Britain one, I do open up from time to time, but like you say, they're just too big to open up, and you're scared that I'm going to break it or something.
Exactly,
you'll
rip it or something.
But they are great, and they've got the names of the places and stuff, and they're useful. I've got some. I do tend to use like the maps in books I mentioned before, the Max Adams book. And that's got great maps in it. So, I'll look at maps in other history books. And I've got an atlas. I'm trying to see where it is on my shelf. But yeah, I've got an atlas of Anglo-Saxon Britain. I'm just trying to find it. Where is it?
Yeah, there's a lots of stuff out there like that. I've got an atlas of Roman Britain that I did use when I was writing Lucia, which is a bit handier than the huge fold-out maps.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I'm trying to find out where I can't see it now on my shelf. But yeah, I have got an atlas of Anglo-Saxon Britain, and it's really useful because each page, as here it is. It's by David Hill, an atlas of Anglo-Saxon England, and each page will cover different topics, like the distribution of forests or things like that, and so it'll be very useful for when you're writing.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that sounds good. Because what I find twice now when I've been writing books, obviously I live in Scotland. I don't really know places like East Anglia very well.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's been 2 times recently where I've been writing a scene in East Anglia, a kind of battle scene, and I've mentioned a hill, And then when I look up the topography on Google Maps again, I realise there's actually no hills
There's no
anywhere near
hills.
these places.
There's no hills. There's no hills. I swore there because there's no hills in East Anglia. In fact, if you go back to the period that we're writing about, lots of East Anglia was underwater at the time.
Right.
So
Okay.
loads of it was fens, and very very difficult to navigate. Really, navigated by water more than by land. I mentioned quite a lot of East Anglia in Killer of Kings. They go there and they end up having a fight. There's a causeway, not a causeway. What do you call it? Like a dike. There's a dike.
Right.
They do travel across. They travel across a causeway earlier on, like a raised Roman road. But yeah, it's all fens and stuff. And
Well,
they
you
comment,
live near there,
about how
don't you?
flat. It's about a 5-hour drive from me, so
Is it as far away as it?
bit of a trek. But
It's like an alien planet to me. Where I live in Scotland,
it's a long way. I've only visited.
everywhere's hills and stuff.
I visited East Anglia like twice.
I don't think I've ever been there. I don't remember. I must have been really young if I ever did go there. It just seems so weird to think of a part of this country that's just so flat.
Yeah, I mean it's really interesting because it is so different, and the fact that so much of it is reclaimed land as well, and that if you look at, I'm trying to think, I've got maps somewhere that show it's probably in that atlas of Anglo-Saxon England actually, where it shows the land as it would have been at the time and the land now, like the two different separate lines, because it's totally different. It's totally different, and lots and lots of, as I said, was underwater. But there's like whole towns that are on medieval maps that don't no longer exist because they fall into the sea and all that sort of stuff. So it's and it's all on that coastline. That coastline is very weird. I mean, it's not. It would have been a very strange place, and I think people were very separate. Fen people were deemed to be, very different from the rest of the mainland. And during the sort of 1066 period after Hereward the Wake, and there was like a rebellion against the or resistance, should I say, against the Norman conquerors, and that all took place around in the fens in East Anglia. And
yeah, that sounds familiar. I've read the James Wilde, a couple of those books about Hereward, and yeah, that definitely brings back a memory of him being in the swamps and stuff.
Yeah.
Because
they could basically hide there. They could go in there, and it's very difficult for the Normans to follow them, because if you didn't know the paths and whatever, you just go in and die. You get drowned or whatever, or get cut off from the road. And
it's really annoying if you're trying to write a historical fiction battle and you've got people up on a hilltop, and then you realise actually there's no hilltop, and that's where Google Maps really comes in. Or there are topographical maps you can look up on the internet as well, and it just. So what I'll then do is I'll find the highest hill I can find near the area, which is basically just a slope to me. But it has to fit,
there are rises.
If a battle really happened in historical fact in the year whatever, then you can't make up a different setting for it. You have to use that setting and try and find some local landmark that's slightly higher than anywhere else.
Yeah, well, if you're writing about after the 7th century, I don't know which book you're talking about, but there's definitely some places that you could use to the south where they've got these big dikes that were defensive dikes, that presumably. So where I've pitched one of my battles there, and there was no historical evidence for the battle taking place there, but they knew the dike was there at the time, and so it had been dug for some sort of defensive position across one of the main roads. It was one of the ancient roadways, the Icknield Way, I think it is. And so there's this big dike cut across, and the dike's still there now. It's huge. And so
that word dike is used for various different things.
Well, this is like Offa's dike, so basically a defensive ditch. I mean, it's the same root as ditch, so it just means a big ditch, really.
But I remember looking up the medieval stuff, and dike would just be used for like a stream, basically.
Yeah, so it means ditch. So but obviously, if it's done for defence, it's bigger and deeper.
Yeah, well, in Scotland, a dike would just maybe be like a small wall or something as well.
Okay,
So aye.
So they use. I think the word is also used for these sort of protective water protection, isn't it? Like in the lowlands in the Netherlands, they use dikes to protect against the sea. where they've reclaimed land, they build a dike.
Right.
So I think it's for walls as well as ditches.
Yeah, that does
So
make
it's
sense.
both.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Although why, I do not know.
Hmm.
So we talked about distance between places. So when the characters are traveling, so one of the simple ways, of course, that I use is to put the two places from on Google Maps and just set it to walking and say, well,
Yeah,
how long does it take them? And it says it's 75 miles will take them, whatever number of hours. And you go, okay, right. Well, let's imagine the roads are a bit worse. They've got to stop for a couple of night, a night on the way or whatever. So you can sort of use that.
yep. I
But
do
if
the
you,
same.
yeah, well, I imagine that if you sort of they're on horseback, you think, well, maybe on a bike,
Yeah,
see
it's
how
halfway between a bike and a walking
something like
speed.
that. But there is a great website, which I mentioned to you the other day, which I'm just going to pull up here, and it's the Stanford Geospatial Network Model of the Roman World. And the web address is orbis.stanford.edu. And on there, you can basically look at the whole of the Roman Empire and say where you want to travel from and to, and then tell it how you want to travel, whether it's by which month of the year it is, and whether you want to go short or by road or by sea or different, all these different things, and it will tell you how long it would have taken in Roman times using Roman roads and Roman ships and things. But I think that's probably very transferable
Closer.
to early medieval.
Yeah, it's closer than our modern roads.
Yeah, it's really useful. So I recommend that for anybody who wants to just to look at it out of interest. But if you're doing any historical fiction writing, it's great because you can say, well, I want to go from London to the south of Spain using coastal waters, in summer or whatever, and it will come out and tell you how long it would
Well,
take.
this is handy because that's one thing you can't do in Google Maps, really,
Exactly,
is
yeah.
a ship journey.
Yeah.
And I've had a couple of those in books, and you're basically just having to guess at the speed of a boat.
Exactly. And that's what I end up doing. If you
Yeah.
can't use this, you sort of, because I've got a few river journeys in the books, and it's like, well, at the moment I've got one, and they're going upstream, and you think, well, how far can you row upstream in a day? And
yeah,
and you start thinking, well, maybe at a push you could do X number of miles, but then is it really doable to do that day after day after
how
day?
tired are
You
they?
get absolutely exhausted.
Yeah.
And they've actually got slaves doing it in the book. They're taken on some sort of royal barge, so they've got slaves taking them. But even the slaves, there's still people.
Yeah, they're still
right?
going to be tired.
They're gonna not be able to keep going without just dying. So yeah, but yeah, that Orbis, the Stanford thing is really useful.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to start using that. Are we doing the fauna and flora?
Yeah, let's move on to fauna and flora. Yeah. So yeah, what do you do when how much do you pay attention to the whole flora and fauna thing?
I don't particularly, but I like to use flowers and things like that to, brighten up a scene. And it obviously has to be correct with the season, but it also has to be correct. Like, they have to be native. We write British historical fiction, so you can't use flowers that would not be native to the UK in AD 500 or whatever. So you have to use the right ones. So I really just use Google constantly and just use various different websites. And my mum is a keen gardener, and she always beta reads the books, and she'll tell me, oh, you can't use this, you can't use that. And quite often she's wrong as well, which I quite like. And because I've obviously researched it and then passed it on to her, and she's researched it, and we've both found various different things. So it's good to go through that process, different people looking at different things and coming up with different ideas. But there are certain ones you need to get right.
Yeah, it was an interesting thing recently. I'm reading someone's book who will remain nameless, but it's really well written. I'm really enjoying the book. But he mentions a couple of things that have stood out as like, and I'm pretty sure it's set in like Anglo-Saxon period. And there's one thing, and this you've sort of researched too much of this period when this jumps out at you. When there's a guy, the sycamore seeds are coming down, and he picks up a sycamore seed, and I was thinking, there's no sycamore seeds in Anglo-Saxon Britain. And I went back and looked at it, and it's basically There's some thought that maybe there were sycamores brought in by the Romans, but probably more likely after the Norman conquest. So they're not native to Britain anyway, and it seems unlikely that there would have been tons of them around.
Yeah, lots of them.
The way he thinks about it is like he doesn't like to go, wow, what's this plant? He's like just thinking about it as like a normal thing that you see loads of them.
But does he pick it up and say, "Oh, there's one of these wee helicopters"?
Basically, it's almost like that. And I can just imagine the writer, he's probably on a walk wherever, and he's seen it and he's stuck in his mind and he's used it. But I'm always very careful whenever I see something like that to go home straight away, research it before I dump it in. And if it says something like they may have appeared in Britain by the 10th century or something, I think I'm not going to include it if it's not certain. If it's not native. I mean, it's native to like southern Europe, so it's pretty unlikely there was lots of them.
Yeah.
But yeah, that you've gone to another level of geekdom when you start to see those sort of things in books. And
I've got one of those trees in my garden, so.
Well, I'm contemplating whether to tell the writer because it's not published yet, the book, and I don't know whether to say something or not about that. But
well, do they not have other trees that have similar things though?
I don't think so.
Those wee helicopter things that swirl down.
You tell me. You can do that research.
I don't know. I'm sure there's other trees that are very similar, maybe beech trees. I don't know. I'm not sure because I don't even know what that tree is in my garden, but I know it's got those wee helicopters.
It's probably a sycamore, I'm guessing.
Well, I thought it was a beech, but who knows?
Well, now, if you're listening to this and you know all about sycamore trees and other things that have seeds that come down like helicopters, then please contact us.
Well, I remember Googling it before and it was not native to the UK. So you're probably right. It will be a sycamore and it's not native to the UK.
There you go. You see?
The daft stuff you do when you're a historical fiction author, you Google your own tree to see if it was native.
Google is your friend. So I've got some books about flora and fauna.
Right.
I tend to use. I've got some like modern books that I found in secondhand shops. And I've got one that's called The Natural History of the British Isles. Just a big hardback that's just got loads of stuff about. But again, I always have to kind of do a second check, about things that I see. But ones that are specific to the Anglo-Saxon period, I've got another one that's called Woodlands of Britain. But then I've got Trees in Anglo-Saxon England by Delia Hook. And that one's very useful. And I've got another one called The Trees and Woodland in the British Landscape by Oliver Rackham. And that's good too. So it's good because they're specific to the Anglo-Saxon period. So they're telling you about the trees that were native at the time.
And do you just do like what I would do? Do you just read through it, skim through it quickly and just underline and highlight parts that stick out to you that you can then go back to and use in a book?
Yeah, I don't think I've read them cover to cover. I'll sort of skim through them, and then some bits I'll sort of turn to some bits and read them in a bit more detail. But there'll be I can't remember how they're broken down, but usually it's like they're broken down by where things grow. So it were like either north of England or south of England, or whether they were used, whether they grew commonly by rivers, or those sort of things. And so I'll kind of group them like that.
Right.
Certain trees that grow more, in boggy ground, and some trees that grow on mountain tops and all that sort of stuff. So, not mountain tops, but you know what I mean, like higher up.
Yeah, higher rocky ground or whatever.
Yeah, rocky
ground. I'm sure actually I never mentioned this before, but you'll be the same as me. There's one thing that we need as historical fiction authors, and that is medicine and the plants that they come from. So I do have a couple of books, especially with me writing about druids. There's plants that they would use for hallucinogenics and medicine.
Do you try those out as well? Do you try them? You try them out on yourself?
I'm very, very straight-laced, Matthew. Just say no, I think was the catchphrase.
How unfortunate. I'm all the time just sort of brewing up,
mushroom
potions,
tea,
mushrooms. Yeah, all my books are written under the influence of highly hallucinogenic mushrooms.
Agaric mushrooms.
That's me.
Henbane.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is exactly the kind of stuff that we need to know, because they couldn't just pop paracetamol, or they couldn't just go and smoke a joint somewhere the way you obviously do when you're writing your books, or shooting up or whatever it is you do.
Shooting up. No.
They obviously had to use the natural ingredients. So I have some books written about that. To be honest, I'm not even on my bookshelf. I don't even know where they are.
I've got a book called Medieval Medicine by Tony Mount.
That rings a bell, that
writes
name.
historical fiction as well.
Well, maybe that's just the name rings a bell.
I've also got a book called Witchcraft in the Middle Ages. You got that one?
I don't think so. No.
No, this one I've not read this one in its entirety, but this is this is from Cornell University.
Oh no, definitely
by Jeffrey Burton Russell.
No.
Witchcraft in the Middle Ages, written and published. Well, it was written in 1972. This was the 5th printing in 1995. This was definitely a second-hand purchase, but yeah, it's quite an academic sort of thing. But I think I saw it somewhere in like an Oxfam shop or something, and thought, "Oh, that looks good."
Well, the thing with a book like that, even if you skim through it and you find practically nothing useful, you might find one line that just really.
Well, the thing is, I'm looking at it now, and I've got a page folded over, and it's got.
That's what I mean.
I haven't looked at this for years. So I mean, I looked at this probably, I don't know, 10 years ago when I was writing one of the books, or 6 or 7 years ago. But it's got the transformation of paganism from 300 to 700 AD. It's talking about the goddess of the sky and Diana and chthonic characteristics of Diana and things like this. It's all very, and about Valkyries and stuff. So there's all sorts of things in there that you can pull out and use in our books.
They do come in handy.
Always good if you want to do a bit of witchcraft.
Always.
What else? Oh, a few books about Vikings. I know I've written obviously A Time for Swords and A Night of Flames, and my new book, which is just which I'm writing at the moment, which has now got a title, which I don't think I'll reveal today. But again, about the Viking age. But I have got some books about Vikings. I don't know if you've got any.
I've got some of the Osprey books. I've got a few of the Osprey books about Vikings, and I've got a few books about King Alfred, which cover the Vikings, and I have some audiobooks as well. The Great Courses. If anybody's on Audible, look up the Great Courses, because they do loads of stuff like King Arthur. But they also do the Vikings and Norse mythology, which I bought. So, yeah, and Saxons vs Vikings. Have you read that?
Yes, the Saxons. No, the Saxons versus Vikings. No, is that?
It must be a short book, because the audiobook only lasts for like 5 hours, less than 5 hours. But it's quite a funny wee book. It's well worth a listen on Audible. But yeah, you should definitely take a look at that. Saxons vs Vikings, because that's basically your period, isn't it?
Yeah, sounds good. So the books that I've got, well, one of them that you said you like the sort of the esoteric nature of stuff and to get under the skin. If you're into that sort of thing, The Children of Ash and Elm by Neil Price is really good. I think you'd like that. It's quite sort of academic but thick, but it's got a lot of stuff. They used it in the movie The Norseman. I think he was one of the consultants on the Norseman movie. Right. He's very much into the whole sort of mindset of why the Vikings were the way they were and what they thought and their sort of thoughts on magic and gods and the world and everything. A little bit too much, I think, maybe, but it's definitely worth reading. I've got a book which I haven't even read yet, but it looks interesting, called The Wolf Age by Tor Skea, and it's I think it's a translation from the Swedish or the Norwegian or something, and that's about the whole of this sort of the North Sea and all of the intra-communications between the different countries and the Norse. River Kings by Kat Jarman, which is again all about the Vikings and the Rus going into Russia and the sort of the Baltic and that.
The Swedes, wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, so those. And I've got an Osprey book about the Vikings as well. The Osprey did one. They've done like a composite one with all of the Osprey books together into one book, which I'll show you here because I saw this. It was actually, this is an Osprey one, but it's a hardback. We don't do many of these, but it basically pulls together a few of their Osprey books into one. It seems to be to me, but it's quite useful.
Well, they do another one, Anglo-Saxon vs Vikings, I'm sure it's called.
Yeah, I've got that one as well.
I've got that one as well. That's quite handy.
This is quite nice, but this is not expensive either. They're really good value.
Yeah, they're a brilliant publisher.
$9.99. It's hardback.
For a hardback, that's excellent.
So, really good.
We've got the one other thing that I use, I don't know about you, but podcasts. I don't know if you ever listen to podcasts or if you know anything about podcasts, Matthew.
No. What are podcasts?
Well, it's quite often it's just a couple of guys talking rubbish for an hour or so. Yeah.
Well, someone listens to that.
I don't know why. It sounds like nonsense to me, but you get history ones as well.
Really?
So the British History podcast was one I was listening to recently about Ragnar Lothbrok and the history of Vikings. So, I mean, I don't want to give just one particular podcast. You can just go into your podcast app and search for whatever period or whoever you want to find. There's loads out there.
I can mention a couple, although I hadn't prepared because I'm terrible. But now you mentioned it, I have got, funnily enough, I have actually heard a few podcasts. And there's a podcast called Gone Medieval. And that, as far as I'm aware, is actually, if I can see it, I think it's actually by Kat Jarman, who I mentioned.
Yeah.
And there's a medieval podcast as well.
That one's good. Is it the one I'm thinking of with the girl that reads it?
Possibly, yeah. I can't remember.
The 5-Minute Medievalist, she's called on Twitter, and she has a podcast that's really, really good.
Yeah, there's all sorts of things, and then you can get to much more specific things. So when I was doing a book about the Forest of Foes is sort of set in Merovingian France, which is coming out in December, the book. And that I found a really good podcast called Thugs and Miracles, A History of France, and it covered all through the Merovingian period. It was like really specific about each of the kings and different things that happened. And when you go that far back into history, there's not a lot of detail. It's really difficult to find history books that have got the detail and stuff. So that was very good for getting sort of like his overview of different kings and different things. That was really good.
And the good thing is they're free. These podcasts are free.
I know. Who'd have thought it? I mean, you know, I would have thought that people could have charged loads of money for these things.
Well, these are really intelligent people that are putting out these podcasts.
And in the case of this one, very good-looking people as well.
Yeah.
I don't know about very intelligent, but
lovely beards. Just like the Vikings of old.
It's true. And maybe, a horn of mead too.
Certainly, I've got my Iron Maiden tankard filled with the finest Scottish ale.
This brings us on to our final questions that we ask our guests, but when we don't have guests, we ask each other. And you were pleased to know I have not prepared for this at all. So I've done what you normally do. I normally prepare for it, and today I haven't. But what have you, Stephen A. McKay, been reading and watching this week?
I've been reading your book, Matthew, as you well know. A Time for Swords. And I finally finished it and left a review on Amazon. It was really good.
Thank you very much. It was a fine review. Maybe, in another episode, you could just read your review out. I think maybe that would be a whole episode.
Yeah.
Just reviewing my books. Well, that's that one review, yeah.
1-star reviews.
Yeah, it wasn't a 1-star, was it? Oh my God.
Well, no, I left 5 stars.
It was a very positive review.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
So what about you, Matthew, then? What have you been reading or watching?
Well, I've been reading, I did say I was reading a book that I didn't name, and now I've slagged it off a bit, so I better not name it. But yeah, so reading a book that hasn't been published yet, but I'm actually enjoying the book, but I've noticed some historical inaccuracies. Now I'm thinking, what do you think? Should I contact the writer, as it's not been published yet, and say what the issues are that I've spotted?
Yes.
The done thing.
Definitely. I did with, the Roman book that I reviewed a while ago. There was nothing wrong in it. It's just they used a word for a certain people I wouldn't have used, and it clashed with a word Bernard Cornwell had used. So I told the author and the publisher, it was an advanced review copy, and I said to them, if I was you, I would change this. It wasn't wrong, as I say. It got the historical accuracy right. It just didn't quite fit. And they changed it. And they were thankful that I'd even mentioned it, because they agreed with what I'd said in the end. So, yeah, I think I certainly would want to know if something was wrong. I would want to know before I published it, but it gives you a chance to fix it. So, yeah, I think you should, Matthew.
Okay, so based on what you've just said, I will contact said author tomorrow and just say I've picked up on these few things. I'm actually enjoying the book. It's really good, but I'll mention it in another podcast and say what the book was.
We might even have them on, and
we could
mention
potentially,
it.
yeah, we could talk about it, yeah. And what have you been watching? Are you watching anything?
I've been watching FBI. Have you ever heard of that show?
I think I watched like the very first series.
I'd never heard of it, but I don't have Sky, and I'm really liking it. It's like Law and Order Special Victims Unit without the really harrowing sexual stuff and victims. You know, it's just like that. So I've been binging that actually. I just sit and play the guitar at night while the kids are in bed, and I just play the guitar while I watch FBI. So definitely recommend that.
Well, I watched another episode of Rings of Power.
Oh yeah, so did
which
I.
Which is moving along a bit. I'm not really sure where it's going, but I'm still sort of
no. I
hanging
must
in
admit,
there.
it's kind of dropped off a bit, hasn't it? The last episode that I watched, it's like it's not really going anywhere. It started off really well, and now it's just kind of sunk a bit.
It's like they've got so much money to spend on this thing. It looks incredible. Everybody looks amazing. It looks just brilliant. And it's like, well, where's it going? What is the story?
It's as if they know where it's going, but they're trying to string it out over too many episodes.
Absolutely. It feels like a 2-hour movie that they've kind of stretched it to be
it's 6 hours
10 hours or something. Yeah.
I'm still enjoying it, but it's definitely after the first 2 episodes that me and you really liked. It's definitely kind of went into a bit of a lull.
Yeah, and it's a pity, but I mean, I'm still going to hang in there and see what happens. Hopefully, it picks up again towards the end. I like some of the characters. And as I say, it all looks great, and I like some of the scene. Some of the scenes and some of the things have been good, but yeah, it seems a little bit directionless.
Yeah.
Our last question, of course. What have you been listening to?
Well, the new Behemoth album came out a couple of weeks ago. I bought a signed copy of that. That's the good stuff for when I'm writing. It's not very melodic or anything, black metal, death metal type stuff. So I've been listening to that and the new Chrysion album, which is also death metal, which I'm sure most readers have no interest in. So what have you been listening to, Matthew? I'm sure your tastes are more palatable.
I don't know. I've been listening to different things. A reader actually contacted me and said after our music episode, has said that he listened to different things when he was writing, and one of the things that he listened to, he said, was the music from the movie The Maze Runner, which I've never watched the movie, but I've been listening to the soundtrack and it's great. John Paisano did the music, and it's a sort of a teen, a YA movie, I guess, sci-fi. But anyway, the music's really, it's action packed but orchestral, good. So I've been listening to a bit of that. And I've also been listening to some black metal.
Good stuff.
Because we have secured a guest, as you know, onto the show sometime in a couple of months. And he's in December, yeah. And he is a proponent of the band Winterfelleth or Winterfilleth. I don't know how to pronounce it. So I've been listening to them. And he also has his own band called Arth.
Was that how you pronounce that?
Doom metal. Yeah, I think so.
It doesn't really sound like doom metal to me. It put me off the doom metal tag, which is like Black Sabbath, very slow and monolithic. It doesn't really sound like that to me. Yeah, well, it put me off that tag, but I've been listening to it and it's actually really good. And there's a lot of kind of choral chanting and stuff like that Winterfilleth uses well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that interview with him. And
so it's a guy called Mark Deeks. Anybody interested? He's a keyboard player and plays other instruments as well, and sings, of course, and writes music. And as we're recording this, I think he's in Germany and going to perform in a cave. Yeah, with Winterfilleth and with Arth. So we're going to talk to him all about that. So I've never listened to much black metal, and so I was listening to Winterfilleth, some of their really heavy stuff that is kind of your screamy, thrashy stuff, and then some of the more folky music as well. It was very interesting, good listening.
Good stuff. One of my favourite bands to write to.
So I may be listening to some. I got a bit headachy after a while with the black metal. Kind of got to me after a bit. It's a bit full on. It's like, oof. I had to turn it down. I think I had it on my normal volume, and it was like, wow, what's going on? My brain's going to melt. Anyway, so that's it for today's episode. We hope you've enjoyed it. Please let us know if you have any questions or things you'd like us to cover in future episodes. You can contact us on the Facebook page, facebook.com/rockpaperswordspodcast. We're on Twitter at rock_swords. You can find out all about our books on MatthewHarffy.com and StephenAMcKay.com. And we're also both on Twitter and Facebook. So look us up, drop by and say hello. The theme music is written and performed and copyrighted by Stephen A. McKay and me. And until next time on Rock, Paper, Swords, it's goodbye from me, Matthew Harffy.
And it's goodbye from me, Stephen A. McKay.
And remember, whatever action and adventure you have going on in your life, be kind, stay safe, and
happy reading.